Nels, what year did you start working for the Michigan Department of Correction?
As I recall, about the year 2000, I was hired by the MDOC to begin a domestic violence program for incarcerated women who had been victims in the free world. I was asked to write the program and to administer it. I was the sole therapist who taught the domestic violence groups in Robert Scott Correctional Facility.
And you went in there specifically trained with domestic violence because obviously the MDOC knew that there were a lot of women there that had issues there, that were battered women with domestic violence. There has to be some connection.
They had already started a waiting list of women who talked about being abused. And when I arrived, there was a waiting list of probably 40 women wanting to get into a group that would treat them for the issues. I began immediately to devise the program, and within a matter of, I had to go through orientation and things, so I wasn't allowed to do it right away. But within a couple of months, I started my first group, and quickly the waiting list grew to about 150, 175 women, and it just continued strong the entire 8 years or 9 years.
When you started working for the criminal justice system, what were your thoughts? What were your beliefs about the criminal justice system at that time when you were brand new?
I was very intimidated to go to work there. I thought these were very desperately wicked and evil people who had committed all kinds of crimes, up to and including murder. I was actually intimidated by them, and I was very anxious to meet my first clients, and I was nervous about being in a room with them, and I was nervous about having a group with them, 12 to 15 ladies. Though they were ladies, they were still, in my mind, very desperate, out of control people, and prison is intimidating. You go in there your first day and you go through this bubble and they have to unlock it for you to go in, and the door locks behind you, and then you go through the next locked door and it locks behind you and everything is locked. It's very intimidating, and I thought, I have taken my life in my hands to work here.
The people that you met in the prison, were they what you expected to meet?
Not at all. That's one of the most pleasant surprises that I experienced. They're basically nice people. I want to be fair and balanced. There were bad people in prison, and people that I'm glad are in prison and should be there, and that's true in the women's prison too. But I was amazed at how many people were really wonderful people. People like my neighbors, and people like family members, and people who were loving and had run across, become fouled from the law, and wound up in prison. And as it related to domestic violence, especially so. I was shocked at how victims were blamed for the crimes and found themselves in prison.
Do you think some of these women ended up in prison because they were maybe poor, weak, and unable to defend themselves in the criminal justice system?
I am convinced of that. I think that one of my biggest disappointments in the system that I worked for is its desire for convictions rather than for justice. I'm convinced that if all the evidence was looked at with proper understanding of what they're looking at, they would have come to different conclusions. But people who cannot afford good lawyers and are disadvantaged, they're easy convictions.
Is it, in your professional opinion, after working 8 years with women in the prison, that there are many women there that were wrongfully incarcerated that should not have gone to prison based on either killing in self-defense or whatever they were sentenced for related to domestic violence.
Absolutely. Yes, unequivocally. When a woman is threatened over and over that she's going to be killed, when a woman is threatened that he's going to kill the children, when attacks occur and they keep escalating until she's very frightened, one day the attack might have a weapon involved. Or in her fear and struggle, she may defend herself with something she grabs, or with a weapon, and people die. And all too frequently, these women are viewed as killers, cold-blooded, heartless killers who purposely premeditated to kill their loving husband, when in my opinion and my experience of having worked with them and talked with them for hours and treated them as a therapist, they were doing nothing more than trying to survive the day of one more attack. One more attack that they dreaded to have come, did not want in the least, and were trying to avoid violence. It's a horrible thing. I have the opinion that they were in prison in that relationship, and now they're in prison in a state prison. They've been in prison in both phases of their life.
Let's talk about the Nancy Seaman case.
Mm-hmm.
Nancy was sentenced to life without parole in 2005
Mm-hmm.
for killing her husband, Bob Seaman. That was a high-profile case. She was known as the Hatchet Lady. And she has 3 judges now that are advocating for her release. And she does have an application on file with the MDOC for clemency that's pending right now. In your opinion, do you believe that Nancy Seaman should be given clemency after working with her in the prison in individual and group sessions?
Yes, definitely. Nancy's a victim of domestic violence. And she did not premeditate to kill her husband in any way. In fact, she premeditated how to leave him without confrontation and how to do it safely. And she went to great lengths to plan an escape that would avoid the very thing that happened. And it didn't work. Yes, she should be released. She should be granted clemency, in my opinion, yes.
Nancy is a nonviolent person. She did her thesis on nonviolent behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And so for her to have killed her husband came as a complete shock to her.
Mm-hmm.
And what she didn't understand until she met you after she was incarcerated during your sessions, Nancy said that you were the one that helped her to understand her behavior before the murder and what happened after the murder. Mm-hmm. She went into excessive force. It's something that's called overkill or excessive force when her husband attacked her on that fatal day in May of 2004.
I became Nancy's therapist, her primary therapist in prison for a time. And one of my jobs is to know if she is violent or not, because her husband was dead and she was convicted of this crime. And you don't just automatically know these things because the news says a certain thing about a person or it's reported in a certain way. You have to do clinical evaluation, and you have to be certain of your treatment that you're going to offer this person. Because if she is a violent person, it's my job to help her to become nonviolent. If she's not a violent person, and if she's a victim of violence, it's my job to help her to understand what has happened to her and what those dynamics are and how to recover from that so that she doesn't have to be victimized in the future. Yes, she is a nonviolent person. She's an extremely nonviolent person. And I was able to ascertain without doubt that violence is contrary to her personality makeup. And yet her husband is dead, and she is convicted of that murder. In my opinion, it's not a murder. In my opinion, she was trying to leave her husband, and he learned of it, and he was trying to stop her, and in the struggle, he was killed. Excessive force. Excessive force, when a nonviolent person is suddenly thrust into a fight with fear for their life, they have no idea of the force that they're exerting or the weapons that they're using because they've never used force and they've never used weapons. Sometimes convicted women are accused of being cold-blooded murderers because they stabbed their assailant or their victim 15 times or 30 times. Well, of course they did. They didn't know that any of those stabs was having any effect. They were fighting for their lives. Sometimes they shoot and they empty the gun into the victims. And to them, that abuser is so powerful and strong that nothing can stop them. Nothing has ever stopped him in their whole experience. He is like a mythical character in power. He has overpowered them numerous times in their life. She has no idea that this isn't another time that is going to happen. And so they fight with what I told Nancy was excessive force, which is just a polite way of saying in terror for their lives, which turns out sometimes to be deadly. No intention to be deadly, just to stop the attack.
Nancy doesn't understand one thing that I'm sure a lot of women would relate with, and that is towards the end, she said the last 6 months of her marriage was just brutal. Bob lost his job a few years ago. He was a civil engineer, and he was spiraling in his life. In fact, he had alcohol and amphetamines were found in his system that same day that he raged at her and attacked her that morning. She was actually on her way to go teach school. And Nancy told me that prior to all of this last 6 months, Bob said to her he wanted her gone, he wanted out, he wanted a divorce. When she said, she begged him, Bob, can we just peacefully try to end this marriage in some way that would be best for both of us? She tried everything she could do, and his response to that was, you can just die, die, die. That would be the peaceful way to end this marriage. He wanted her kicked to the curb with nothing. And actually, Nancy was she was for the most part holding it together, very stable. She was waiting. She purchased a condo 5 months prior, not with the marital assets, but her father. He went and put a down payment on the condo for her so that she could try to leave in peace and have her own place. And Bob did not know about this condo purchase. That was the final trigger for him that sent him into a rage. To this day, Nancy does not have any idea how Bob found out that she had a condo, that she was on her way out. Now, since he stated he didn't want her anymore, why? Nancy's confused. She said, wasn't he overjoyed that I had a condo? I was getting out of his life. Why didn't he say, I'll help you pack, I'll help move you? Instead, it had the complete opposite effect. It sent him into a rage.
Kelly, that's a dynamic that I've encountered many times in domestic violence. One of the ways that men demean women is to say they don't love them, they want them out of their lives would be so much better without them. One of the ways that they maintain power in this emotional hierarchy is to demean their partner with comments like this. However, I'm going to say psychologically, behind that facade is a man who, if she actually left, is stripped of all of his power and is left alone with himself, who he has no idea how to go forward or to live, and his life is over. His emotional life is over. In domestic violence, we know that the very most dangerous time for a woman is when they leave. Mm-hmm. That is the most likely time that children and women and men die. The most typical way that they die is murder-suicide. The man is usually the killer, and he usually kills the children, he kills the wife, and then he shoots himself. Why does he shoot himself? He's been complaining about this woman and he hates her and he can't stand his life because she's in it. But the truth is, he can't stand his life, and she has propped him up all this time. For 8 years, I treated men who abused women, and I feel bad for them too. They're tormented people. However, I cut them no slack, because taking their torment out on their families is not acceptable.
In 2005, you wrote a letter advocating for Nancy Seaman, that you diagnosed her as being a battered woman and with nonviolent behavior. You were advocating on her behalf while you were still employed for the Michigan Department of Corrections. And you paid a price for that. Is that correct?
Yes, I did. Mm-hmm. Let me tell how that went. Her case was going to an appeal, and I had a strong opinion about her case. I believe she was innocent, and domestic violence counselors advocate for victims of domestic violence. I was hired by the Michigan Department of Corrections to run a domestic violence program. I thought that's what I would do. I had advocated for many victims of domestic violence in the past, to judges and to courts, and so I very happily wrote the letter, and in the letter I basically stated this is a nonviolent person, and she would not do a premeditated murder. And I sent that letter, and to my surprise, my supervisor came in some months later and said, with a copy of my letter, and said, "Did you write this letter?" And I looked at it and I said, "Yes, I did." And he didn't like that answer, and he suggested that prisoners, being the horrible people that they are, that it was very possible that Nancy had snuck into my office during off hours and wrote the letter herself and signed my name to get me in trouble. And I said, "Oh no, Bill." I said, "I wrote it. I wrote the letter." And he said, "Okay." And he walked out. I wasn't aware yet that I was in any trouble because I'm a little slow. But as I sat there thinking, I started to think, Bill seems to be upset about that. So I went in his office and I says, "Bill, did I do something wrong?" And he says, "Well," he said, "I just needed to know if you wrote that letter." I said, "Yes, I wrote it." And so I just went back to work and I just continued. Well, the next thing, I was being investigated for breaking state rules. And they sent an investigator to my office to ask me a bunch of questions about the letter, and I said, yes, I wrote the letter, and the letter's true and right. Now, interestingly, I thought the courts would be happy to have that letter because I thought they didn't know what I knew. And I thought they wanted to know these things. It would help them to come to justice for Nancy. However, that didn't seem to be the case. So they found me guilty of 3 rules of the prison, and well, before they found me guilty of that, they said I can have no more contact with Nancy Seaman. She was my client. I was her therapist, but that was to end. I wasn't to write to her, talk to her, and I couldn't see her. I don't remember if I told Nancy that or someone else did, but anyhow, Nancy was told. And Nancy is such a good lady. She never violated that. She never talked to me or tried to reach me in any way, and nor I her. And they found me guilty of 3 things. They said that I could be fired for any one of those things, and they took me to a review, and they gave me the stiffest penalty they could short of firing me. I spent about 6 months thinking I'd probably be fired. It was very harrowing for me.
Fired for writing a letter advocating for a woman in prison who you believe is innocent.
Yes.
Because you were thinking you were doing the right thing, this is just, and you wanted justice for this woman.
I still want justice for this woman. Yes.
Did you know that there are 3 judges advocating for her now? Her own sentencing judge wrote Governor Snyder asking for her to have clemency, to give her clemency. Federal Judge Bernard Friedman also wrote Governor Snyder asking for Nancy Seaman to have clemency. And why do you think that this falls on deaf ears?
Well, I hope that it doesn't fall on deaf ears. I hope they hear this plea. I hope that these judges, which I'm sure are honorable people who know the law, and myself, who am a trained therapist in domestic violence and understand the dynamics of those human beings involved in that terrible issue, I hope that the parole board and the governor or whoever is hearing the appeal will listen to this and release her. But that wasn't your question. Your question was, why does it appear to be falling on deaf ears? I have to say I don't know. I do know that the prison system is very loath to give up prisoners. Why? I don't know what to say. There are some prisoners I don't want them to give up. I'm glad they're in prison. But I would like justice, and there are some prisoners I wish they would let go. And why they're loath to give up good people back to their families and to the free society where they belong, I don't have an answer for that.
Are you familiar with Karen Kanzler?
Very much, yes.
And you know, Karen Kanzler is now 69 years old, blind in one eye, shaking with tremors. She was brought before the parole board in 2015. Her sentencing judge, Norman Lippett, also went to that same parole board hearing, and she was grilled about, they wanted her to say that she premeditated the murder of her husband 30 years ago. Mind you, this is a 30-year-old crime. And Norman Lippett was there to tell the parole board, I made a huge mistake when I sentenced her. So this is the sentencing judge advocating for her release. And so out of 10 members of the parole board, 4 were for her release and 6 were against it.
Mm-hmm.
And what is the thinking of the parole board that they want this woman incarcerated when she could hardly be a danger to society if she were released? And why can't we have access to that information? Because they did not give a reason as to why they were against her being released.
Again, I can't answer why, but I will say this. I know Karen Kanzler, and I was her therapist for a while. She is absolutely nonviolent. She is as nice a lady as you will ever find. She is a mild-mannered person. I can't think of a more harmless person in society than Karen Kanzler. I would not only welcome her into my community, I would welcome her into my family and into my home. She's 69 and in poor health, and I consider her a friend of mine because I know her as a very fine person. There is no reason for Karen Kanzler to be in prison, and Judge Lippitt, who said he made a mistake, I'm going to say very respectfully to Judge Lippitt, he made a mistake. As a therapist, I can say she's not a murderer. He made a mistake.
Norman Lippitt admitted that he did not know a lot about domestic violence in the 1980s. Mm-hmm. And that's what I'm finding. And when I talk to law enforcement and talking to judges or former judges, they all admit that they really didn't know a lot about domestic violence and the dynamics of it. They didn't grow up in that. They grew up in a loving home. And so this was all completely foreign to them. Mm-hmm. And so Norman Lippitt, he said that. So did Jack McDonald. You know, when he sentenced Nancy Seaman, it was later on, as time went on, that they learned more about the dynamics of domestic violence. They heard from Dr. Lenore Walker, you know, an expert in battered women syndrome. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, through that understanding, so obviously there needs to be a lot more training in our courts.
Yes.
Attorneys, judges, law enforcement, all the way through to really get an understanding
yes.
of the dynamics of domestic violence, and that there are a lot of women in prison that don't deserve to be there.
Yes, there has to be a lot of training in law enforcement and in the court system, and there has to be a lot of training in psychology. Well-intentioned prosecutors, judges, and jury members, and whoever else, lawyers, they go into court well-intentioned, but without an understanding of what they're judging. People who are well qualified to investigate crime of every type are not well qualified to investigate domestic violence crime. They need expertise that few people have. I went to work at the prison with real wondering if I was doing the right thing and a lot of fear. And it turns out it's one of the very best career moves that I ever did as far as working with the women there. I have more lasting friends and relationships with former clients than I ever imagined that I would. And I came away from the women's prison with great respect for women who have suffered in ways that I can barely fathom. I respect them. They're survivors. They're strong and good women, and I'm glad I worked with them. I count them my friends.
And you want to see justice.
We certainly do, yes.
And justice comes in the form of clemency for many of them.
Yes, it does. It comes in the form of new laws. It comes in the form of fair trials. It comes in the form of education amongst people who are going to making judgmental decisions. It comes in the form of men stop battering women and start respecting them as our equal and loving them as we should. It comes in many, many forms, and certainly releasing victims of domestic violence into the free world is one of the places we should start. We should do all that I have just said.